Hello, I'm Barbara Peters. Welcome to another episode of the Criminal Calendar. 2 or 3 shows ago, I said that I thought our guest Peter May might hold the record for how far someone had come to sit here with me and talk. But we have a close, possibly a dominating second today at Lindsey Davis from Greenwich, England.
Hello, Barbara. I'd like to be dominating. Yes, that suits me.
Lindsey and I have been friends for, we were thinking today, 20 years.
We have.
And I was casting my mind back to the first time we met. She had just published, no, it was maybe Shadows and Bronze had come out.
It was one of the very early books, definitely.
It was definitely, I think I had just read Shadows and Bronze, and I was then doing columns for a mystery magazine, and so I was able to set up an interview with Lindsey in London. And I often think as I go by that coffee shop on my visits to London, I like to bang up one of those historic plaques. Lindsey and Barbara met here. What are they? They're what, blue tile?
Blue plaques, they are. In London, they're blue. But you have to have been dead for 100 years or something before you can have one. So we will never see it if we get one.
I see. Our heirs, our descendants will get to notice it. But it was a wonderful introduction because we met in this kind of steamy coffee shop in a booth, right?
Yes.
And discovered that we had something really in common, that a person, in fact, that we both grew to love very much.
Ellis Peters, Edith Barchester.
And it was interesting because I think that Edith, maybe I'll call her Ellis Peters because people won't know her by the Edith Barchester name here as well, had really been writing for what, like 40 years before
yes.
she came up with her first Brother Cadfael book, A Morbid Taste for Bones.
I had read her straight historical novels, which she wrote as Edith Barchester, which was her real name, I think, when I was very young, in my teens. Probably, so we won't go too closely into how long ago that was, but it was quite a long time. And she'd been writing for years before that. When I started to write historical detective novels, I had not even heard of, and certainly not read, the Brother Cadfael books, which were really the only ones at that time, weren't they? Or the only ones that were being published. There may have been occasional ones.
There may have been a few.
Had gone out of print, but
the historic, as with all genre fiction, things rise and fall, and the historical novel had a huge vogue for a long time. You got people like Samuel Shellabarger, and you got, lots of stuff, and then it kind of died away. And a lot of people who wrote history were attracted into crime because it's easy to do. People die.
Well, it wasn't only that, but we're talking about now the end of the 80s, the start of the 90s, when I started out writing. And it was said by publishers, first of all, that they couldn't sell history at all. Historical novels were then in a dip, from which they've amazingly recovered now, I can say. And also, they were not keen on anything too old. So the Romans were seen as very frightening for the public. How Ellis Peters got away with Brother Cadfael, I just don't know.
I've often thought about the fact, because I saw her not too long before she died, and she was working so hard on a book. In fact, I knew she was not going to make it when she said to me that she simply could not get the plot to come together, and her circulation was failing, and I think her memory with it. And I could see that if she couldn't write her book, she didn't see a great deal of reason to soldier on.
She wrote me a letter shortly before she died, and I had exactly the same impression, that for her to be able to write was what made life worthwhile, and that's something I understand, really.
Well, she had eschewed marriage and children because she had felt, she's written about it quite a lot, that if she wanted to be a writer, that she couldn't divide her life that way. But what I thought was interesting is she'd put herself on a course with the Brother Cadfaels, because they really take place during the wars between Stephen and Matilda for who should gain the throne after Henry went down. Well, no, he died, and his heir had gone down on the White Ship, right, in the Channel, and left the daughter. But anyway, her dream was to actually carry that series to when Henry II got to the throne. And what was bothering her the most, I think, was that she was maybe 2 or 3 books short of the chronology that, so it had been a long-term project, a bit like Sue Grafton wanting to do the entire alphabet. Edith
Yes.
had wanted to do the whole war and get there. And I was always sorry, but you know, that 20th book was really, in a way, the final book in the series. I mean, I thought she left it by some
Yes.
internal alchemy, maybe, at the right page. But the reason I was thinking about her was that she was not inclined to read other authors' work and give them quotes, and it was so wonderful that she did, in fact, give you a lovely quote for your first novel, The Silver Pigs, your
Yes.
first published novel.
That for me as an author was splendid. And beyond that, of course, then I wrote to thank her, and we corresponded for several years until she did sadly die. And I met her a few times as well.
Well, not only did you meet her, but you and I, in fact, went together to her Diamond Dagger
We did
presentation
indeed.
in the House of Lords.
We did, which was an evening to remember. And I think she was genuinely fond of me because she appreciated the way I wrote in the same way that I had from the start when I read her as a young person. Understood what she was saying and what kind of a woman she was. It's partly to do with standards. It's writing well, having a moral code of some sort. It doesn't have to be the same as the person who's reading your work, but to have a strong sense of what things should be, which Edith certainly had, didn't she?
She did, and yet she didn't shy away, nor do you, from difficult or controversial subjects.
No.
And she did them well in the context of the time. I think my favorite book of hers is the one where the husband leaves the wife because he's gained a vocation as a monk. And there she was, you know, left neither widow nor religious, and her whole life was shattered, and yet everybody applauded him, whereas I wanted to kill him.
Yes, me too, and I suspect Edith as well.
She did, and that's something I like in your series too. Is that you do range about over any number of interesting and unorthodox behaviors.
Well, for me, it's not only the behaviours; it's to range about generally. Really, I could not write a series where every book was the same. I know there are authors who do it. We won't name any names and be controversial, and there are readers who find that very comforting. There's no doubt about it. They know what they're going to get when they open the next book. But then I feel that the people for whom I'm writing would be bored, as I would be bored writing them, and I want in every book to write a different book from any of the others that have gone before.
Well, that's true. You've done your serial killer book. That was...
Yes, I did not enjoy that. I felt I had to do one and
did?
get it out of the way.
Why so?
It was too horrible. And
No. Why did you feel you had to do it?
Because they were in vogue, and I go with fashion, and I want the reviewers to read them and say, Lindsey Davies has written a really gritty book here, though they didn't, of course, because that's not how historical novels are viewed.
Was that Three Hands in the Fountain?
That was Three Hands in the Fountain. The other one I didn't enjoy particularly was the one about gladiating, which again I felt I had to do. That's perhaps more obvious because it was a part of Roman life, and I felt I had to address it. And I addressed it in the worst way. I did the killing of the animals as well as the killing of the men. And it was not as much sheer fun as some of the others have been, Saturnalia in particular.
Yes, well, and we'll catch a Saturday. But to go all the way back to Silver Pigs, I know there's a kind of heart-wrenching story there about, you know, person who wants to write struggling with a novel. It's
yes,
a real,
indeed.
You know, Dickensian story.
It is a Dickensian story, and it's like a fairy story, and perhaps we should very briefly go through it. Before I became a writer, I'd been a civil servant. I worked for the government for quite a long time and was becoming very unhappy with it, in that I was always being given the hard jobs to do and never getting the rewards for it, never being promoted. So I left my job, and I always have to say I left the job first and then considered the fact that by then I was 35, which is the age I always recommend that writers should start to write, because I think you have to have lived first.